Thank you very much. So thank you very much for the organizers for organizing such a great conference and having a paper on the program. This is a joint work with Irina Telyukova, and actually our paper is related to all the papers that we saw today. So I guess I can skip a lot of stuff. But what we are going to add to the discussion of today is that we are going to look at the cross-country data, especially between US and European countries. So let me give you a little bit of motivation, although we learned a lot today, I think. But the big question is in the US and many other countries, many people, many households die with a positive amount of wealth, significant amount of wealth. And this is not consistent with a very standard bare-bone life cycle model without any uncertainty or bequest motive. Then you expect that households die with exactly zero wealth, but that's not what we see in the data. And there's a discussion of why that's the case. And of course, there are a lot of solutions candidate proposed. One is a risk, longevity risk, or healthcare expense risk that we saw in a couple of papers. Or maybe it's a bequest motive. Many people, many individuals want to die with some amount of wealth so that somebody inherits those wealth. And related to this risk is a public care version, especially in the US. It is argued that you need to pay a lot more than what you can get from the public healthcare insurance to enjoy a nice nursing home. And these things are proposed as candidates to explain why many people die with positive amount of wealth, but it's a hard identification problem because unless you bring in some extra data, what you see is just a decumulation, slow decumulation pattern, and all these explanations, if you think about the model with one of these explanations, all the models generate kind of the same thing, the slower decumulation of wealth. So it's a kind of hard identification to solve. And on top of that, in a series of papers with Irina, we propose another candidate to already kind of crowded field. We argue that if you look at housing and non-housing assets, instead of just looking at the total wealth, these two behave very differently. So as we know that from the series of work of Venti and Weiss, many households do not really sell the house after retirement. On the other hand, financial assets are relatively fastly decumulated. So big chunk of this answer about why people don't decumulate wealth is that people just don't sell houses. So that's what we added to this discussion about why people die with positive wealth. And this is an important issue, obviously, because a lot of huge chunk of savings are held by those retirees in US and other countries. And whenever the government is trying to do pension reform or healthcare insurance reform, then that affects the aggregate savings. And how this affects the aggregate savings depends on why those older households are saving. So that's a big question from the macro perspective. And it's especially important because there are more and more retired households. So in aging environment, it's even more important question, I think. So what we try to add in this paper is to look at the cross-country evidence. So we are going to show cross-country facts about the decumulation pattern of total assets and housing and financial assets to shed some light about why elderly desave slowly. And in the second part of the presentation, we are going to focus on US and Sweden and try to use the differences, especially in terms of risk, out-of-pocket healthcare expense risk. It's small in Sweden, although it's much bigger in the US, and we use these differences to identify the importance of the healthcare risk in explaining the slow decumulation of total wealth in retirement. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to construct a model, and we use the difference in the US and Sweden as inputs and try to explain the difference in terms of decumulation pattern between the US and Sweden. And by that, we are trying to figure out how important is the risk in explaining the slow decumulation pattern. So I think we started working on this paper because there's HRS that we saw many times in this afternoon. And the HRS is for the US, and there's there's a kind of counterpart in the continental European country called SHARE, and in the UK, ELSA. These are kind of harmonized with HRS, so it's very easy to compare with the US. So that's why we decided to look at this data to see what kind of differences we can find between the US and the European countries. And that's kind of why we started this project. And there are a lot of papers study using HRS and SHARE and ELSA to do similar kind of cross-country comparisons for different questions. So data, unfortunately, we use only cross-section today because when we started this project, SHARE didn't have enough data to enable us to do the cohort-based analysis. So we show basically cross-section in 2006. And it's nice to use 2006 because it's before all the crises and recessions happened. And so we use the 2006 cross-section for ELSA, and to be consistent, we use the 2006 cross-section for the US and UK as well. And there are some papers like Brandero and his co-authors do a cohort-based analysis to do the comparison between US and UK, which is possible, but because we want to see the continental European countries, we use this cross-section instead of cohort-based analysis. Okay. And the first is the accumulation pattern of net worth. And x-axis is the age starting from 65 to ending at 90. And this figure shows that one line is for one country and shows how the median net worth mostly declines over the life cycle. And net worth includes all the financial assets and non-financial wealth, in particular housing, and net of all the debt, in particular mortgage debt. And you can see that the positive in general negative, so there's a accumulation, but it's not very rapid. For example, if you look at the US, which is blue, US is here. So it starts from median is $200,000 to 100. So even for the 19-year-old, median 90-year-old household has about $100,000, which is very large, I think. And you can see the similar pattern for many European countries. And in particular, we're going to focus on Sweden, which is pink. So look at pink. Pink line starts from about 150 to close to 0. So the accumulation seems slightly faster than the US than Sweden, and many countries, especially in the northern European countries, you can see a slightly larger, faster accumulation pattern than the US.
Household median net worth?
It's a household median net worth, yes. Yeah.
And then poor people die earlier.
Yeah.
So they are not the same people.
They're not the same people, that's correct.
You're acting as if they were the same people. Like saying they're 7 too little, unless you know who they are.
Yeah. No. When we go to the model, we do this. We correct for the survival bias. So the model output is taking into account this poorer people die earlier. So which basically gives an upward bias to this line, right? Because the richer people tend to live longer, which pushes up this line a little bit longer. But the previous studies find that that's not enough to collect this figure to go all the way down to 0. So it's a part of the explanation of this not too steep slope, but not all of it. And it's going to be corrected when we go to the model. Yeah.
Were you surprised to learn that there was a decreasing net worth? Because I'm surprised. I didn't think that was the case.
Yes. Why?
I don't know. It's just, at the end of life, that you're not, that the property you have is probably all paid up, and it's worth, if it's valued at 600,000, then it's worth 600. Then you have 600,000.
Mm-hmm.
But I was just surprised that this is the case. That this is all declining.
So as I said, it's cross-section. So if, for example, if you look at if you follow the same households over time in the US or the UK, it's actually upward sloping because of the property value went up during this, especially during this sample period, right, which is available. But that's if you keep track of the same households, but you control for the change in the property value, then actually picture looks like this.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah. So part of, yeah, what you said is correct, but this is kind of, by looking at the cross-section, it's kind of corrected for this kind of problem that you mentioned.
Okay.
There is no wavering financial requirement, it's very tough to sort of liquidate their financial loss.
Yeah, true.
So why did you choose Sweden as opposed to Netherlands, for example? Why?
I'll tell you later, yeah, yeah. I mean, the short answer is Sweden looks similar in the US in many dimensions among these countries. That's why we picked this Sweden, but yeah. And also, I think we happened to talk with some Swedish friends when we are thinking about this project, I think. But yeah, initially we were thinking about solving the model for all the countries. That's what the original plan, but we started with the country that we are a little bit more familiar with, which was Sweden, yeah. But I think the pattern is, I mean, some countries have a different, yeah. Okay, let me go on.
But Italy, for example, is quite interesting, right?
Hmm?
Italy seems to be a bit of an outlier here in terms of. What is the yellow? No, sorry, NL, Netherlands.
Yeah.
that's why I said-
Yeah.
It's a bit of a.
Yeah, so I mean, the problem of this kind of cross-country analysis is that there are a lot of differences across different countries. So I guess it's, yeah.
But one could learn something perhaps out of this, that how come that they don't hold on to wealth.
Yeah. Yeah, but yeah. So I tried to quantify the speed of, the slope that we saw in the previous figure by computing the average net wealth for the late 80s divided by the average net wealth of 60s. And this number is, of course, less than 1 because all countries have, in general, negative slope. And the US is about 60%, and Sweden is about half of it. But yeah, there's a large heterogeneity, and especially yeah. And now we separate financial assets, which is net of financial debt, mortgages. So it's basically non-housing assets. And just look at the non-housing assets and look at the decumulation pattern. And the US is on top. It's very different from the rest of the European countries. And the reason we picked Sweden has the most and closest to the US, especially if you normalize by the average, the median pension income for Sweden and US, it's basically on top of each other, age 65. That's why we picked Sweden for this analysis. And for many other countries, for many European countries, they start from a much significantly smaller amount of financial wealth than the US, and the decumulation seems to be faster, going faster towards zero. That's what we saw here. And in terms of the housing assets, first look at the extensive margin. This figure shows how the homeownership rate changes. This is a median house value among homeowners change over the life cycle. And as you can see, it's close to very flat, which is already documented by a paper by Venti and Weiss, for example, that the retirees, they don't really move to a smaller house. Very often they stay in the same house. So that's what we see here. But
so the line for the Netherlands seems to be inconsistent with what you showed earlier about being accumulated on a fast pace.
This one.
Yeah, the yellow one.
Yeah, because extensive margin is very fast. Yeah, yeah. So this is a home ownership rate, basically extensive margin adjustment. You can see declining, in general, declining pattern for all countries, and Netherlands is very much faster than the US. And US is again in blue. And it's also a slow decline in the home ownership rate in all countries, but the pattern looks similar, more similar compared with the decumulation pattern of financial assets, in the sense that it's not like a continental European countries are clustered close to the zero. The home ownership rate stays relatively high even among the 90-year-old.
So is that right? 90% own a home in the US?
Yeah.
At age 65?
Yeah, 88. Yeah.
It's huge.
Yeah, I know. I don't know.
So it's like, sometimes there's a problem with how data are collected.
What do you mean?
People that are in institutions.
Sorry, what?
Sometimes the way they collect data, they track people
Mhm.
by their address,
Mm-hmm.
and they may be in a retirement home and they're missed, this thing takes proper care of that?
At least HRS, yes. For the US, yes. Yeah, they keep track of people who go into nursing home as well. But I guess attrition is stronger for these people, but I'm not too familiar with this. But yeah. There's you can see transition from your home to nursing home, back to home, this kind of transition you can see in HRS. But not necessarily in other countries. Yeah, that's one problem. And one more thing I want to show is the proportion of households with positive amount of secure debt, mostly mortgages, or unsecured debt, mostly credit card debt. And in terms of debt, the pattern is similar that the retirees, elderlies, they just keep repaying their debt, and at age 90, there's a very small fraction of households with a positive amount of debt in all countries. And another reason we pick Sweden is that, as you can see, that the pattern of debt repayment is very similar between US and Sweden, which kind of we take it as evidence that in terms of the mortgage market or the credit card market, there's not much difference, significant difference, at least compared with other countries between US and Sweden. So finally, so these are kind of, so one big difference that we want to exploit in this paper is the out-of-pocket healthcare expense risk. And this is just the mean out-of-pocket healthcare expense for the US in blue and all the European countries in other colors. And you can see that the mean healthcare expense is much higher in the US, about 10 times more than Sweden, for example. And the risk, I'm going to show you the risk, but the risk, the standard deviation of the healthcare expenses are also much higher in the US than Sweden. And what we are trying to do is to figure out how this difference in the amount of healthcare and the risk associated with healthcare expenses translate into the difference in the accumulation pattern of total assets and financial and housing assets.
What do you call it risk?
Oh, this is not a risk. This is just a mean, but the risk, I'm going to show you that the risk is also high. Some measure of risk is also higher in the US. I'm going to show you in the later.
So these are some PPO adjusted dollars or something?
Yeah. So, kind of loosely speaking, that's what we kind of see from these figures that I showed. So in terms of net worth, the accumulation pattern, there's a large dispersion across countries, but all countries exhibit kind of slow accumulation, and the US in the middle. But it's Sweden, in particular, the country we focus on, Sweden is going to show the slightly faster accumulation pattern than the US. And the difference between Sweden and the other countries are more pronounced for financial assets, like non-housing assets. And for housing, all countries exhibit kind of slow accumulation, and especially slower than financial asset accumulation. And the US in the middle, and there's not much systematic differences across countries. Okay? And in terms of out-of-pocket healthcare expenses, I'm going to be more clear about the risk, but the US households are facing significantly larger risk than European countries, Sweden in particular. And what we are trying to argue is that one of the explanations put forward to explain this slow accumulation pattern is a high risk and precautionary savings motive to prepare against a big risk in medical expenses, especially towards the end of life. And if in Sweden, public healthcare insurance covers a lot of the risk. So the risk is much smaller in Sweden, and the amount is a lot smaller in Sweden. So there's much less need to keep saving in Sweden compared with the US, in American households. And we are trying to argue that so we are trying to argue how important is this explanation from the size of the risk to the accumulation pattern using this Swedish and US data. And we also trying to argue that in the previous studies we find that housing is not closely related to the risk in the sense that regardless of risk, many households just want to stay in the same house and as long as possible. And mostly households, if you look at housing assets and non-housing assets separately, households seems to use financial assets to pay for the medical expenses and try not to use the house until the last moment that they cannot do anything else. So that pattern also you can see by comparing US and Sweden. In Sweden, the financial asset accumulation pattern seems to be much faster than the US, but the difference between US and Sweden seems to be much smaller in terms of housing. That's what we are trying to argue, and that's what we're trying to confirm with the model. So let me move on to the model-based analysis with the focus on Sweden. So why US and Sweden? As I showed you in a series of slides, they're similar in terms of the average asset, especially normalized by the average amount of income, pension income, and in terms of debt repayment profile, they're similar. So that's one reason why it's kind of US might be relatively similar to the US. And Swedish households exhibit faster accumulation, relatively faster accumulation in terms of the total assets and also financial assets. And there are stark differences in terms of out-of-pocket healthcare expense risk, which I'm going to show later.
Makoto, so
Yeah.
I guess in some places, some health benefits or public nursing home that you might get might be means tested.
Yeah.
And housing might be excluded from the means test in some places, right? Do you know anything about that?
I think in the US, some states probably don't, some states do, yeah. But I don't know more than that, yeah. So these figures compare US and Sweden, but I guess I'm just extracting US and Sweden from the previous figure that I showed already, so there shouldn't be new stuff. But the median net worth, now I normalize by the income, at median income at 65, which makes US and Sweden very similar. So Swedish households accumulate faster in terms of median net wealth. And you can say it's faster in terms of the accumulation of financial assets as well. But in terms of the housing, the home ownership rate, the Swedish household starts slightly lower than the US, like 10 percentage points lower than the US households, and this difference that stays throughout the life cycle. So it doesn't seem to be Swedish households are in hurry to sell the houses compared with the American households. And the median housing assets, median housing value divided, relative to the median income is, Sweden is kind of jumpy, but in general you can see that the pattern is similar. There's no strong downsizing pattern in terms of the value of the house. So the pattern difference between US and Sweden is similar even if we look at different income quintile, for example. In these figures, for example, in the US, we take HRS and we put different households into different income bins depending on the average income throughout their life cycle, and we keep track of the same households according to this classification. And of course, the one on the top is the one on the top quintile in terms of income, and the bottom one, blue one, is the bottom quintile households, how they accumulate wealth over the life cycle. And in the US, it's kind of relatively flat. And yeah. And actually, like Victor said, these guys are dropping out faster than these guys because we look at the same type of households. So this gives this attrition bias pushes up the median line upwards, for example. And if you look at the Sweden, the pattern, the accumulation pattern, you can see that the accumulation seems to be faster for all income quintiles from top to bottom. That, especially on the top, Swedish households seem to be accumulating much faster than the American counterparts. So what I'm trying to argue that this difference in the accumulation pattern in the net worth is not coming from the composition or something. It's true for all the income groups. And I showed this figure already. And this is, so next, we try to kind of highlight the differences in terms of healthcare expense risk between the US and Sweden. So what we did is the following. So we compute the mean out-of-pocket healthcare expense for let's look at the U.S. We compute the mean out-of-pocket healthcare expense for different health status. We aggregate to 3 types: poor, good, and excellent, and the 5 income groups and all the age groups. And we compute the mean for each age and each income group and each health status, and we run a dummy variable regression. And the figures that I'm showing here are the age coefficient and with the health coefficient added on the top figure and the income coefficient added in the case of bottom figure. And of course we put all the interaction terms. That's why it's not like shifting up and down in parallel. And you can see that and we did the same thing for Sweden. So these are the age coefficients of the mean out-of-pocket healthcare expenses, and we look at different household in different health status, excellent, good, poor, but they're differences are very small compared if I use the same y-axis as US, because it's a lot smaller, and the difference is minimum if you put on the same scale with the US. And we did the same thing for the standard deviation around the mean that I expected, I computed in the previous figure. So I compute the standard deviation of out-of-pocket healthcare expenses, deviation from the mean that I computed in the previous year, and we also ran the dummy variable regressions.
So that I read the opposite, because the right statistic is the coefficient of variation. So did it normalize by units?
What?
Why don't you put the coefficient of variation?
Yeah.
Would be the true measure of risk.
Oh no, it's the healthcare expenses are logged, so it's a logged medical expenses. That's what you're asking?
Oh, it's log
Yeah, it's logged. Yes. Yeah. So the unit is controlled. Yeah. Yeah, that's why it's wait.
Did you include any preventive medical expenses?
Sorry, say it again.
Did you include any preventive medical expenses in the?
Preventive. Yeah, I put the total out-of-pocket medical expenses. Yeah.
So it's not just for the treatment of actual cancer, but it also has some spending on like
Checkup and.
Okay, checkup.
Yeah, it's we didn't distinguish. Yeah, we could do it, I guess, but yeah, we didn't do it.
When you talk out of pocket, does that also include the sort of co-pays that are paid throughout the life?
Yeah, it's out of pocket, so co-pays included.
Co-pays and everything else?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, and one more thing I forgot to say. In the case of the US HRS, we added the as long as we can capture, we added the expenses, out-of-pocket expenses for nursing home care. So nursing home cost is included as healthcare expenses here. And for Sweden, we don't have the number, but another reason we picked Sweden is that the out-of-pocket nursing home expenses is very small compared with the US. So the fact that the data set we use don't capture this out-of-pocket health nursing home expense is not a serious problem for the case of Sweden.
But those nursing home expenses in Sweden are income dependent.
Yes. Yeah.
And to a large degree, so it can be very expensive if you have wealth.
Yeah. Yeah, because yeah.
So you're not controlling for that here.
That's why we are trying to control for the income groups. So I think this part recaptures the. This part recaptures that this red line on the top captures that the rich guys are paying a lot for the.
That's in the US. I'm saying the same thing actually happens.
Oh, in Sweden. Yeah, that part we cannot capture. Yeah.
But that's why it matters how they treat your primary residence, right? If that gets taken account in your wealth or not.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but I don't remember what they do with Sweden, but yeah.
But you could take out the nursing expenses in the US
Yeah.
to do a comparison perhaps.
Oh yeah,
So
that's
Sweden doesn't have. But
true. Yeah. But I mean, but the reason we added is that it's a big chunk of healthcare expenses in the broad term, and it's relatively small. That's what we learned kind of from the literature in Sweden. So these are kind of going to be model inputs, and
Can you tell us before that?
yeah,
You're going to run a model, you're going to have a model, and you're going to have IUS and something called the Sweden.
yes.
And then what do you tell us your theory, what makes them different?
So I think let me tell you what we had in mind at the beginning, which is kind of crazy, but what we had in mind in the beginning is that we assumed that the preferences are same between the American and Swedish people. So they're basically exactly the same people, but they're facing a different kind of healthcare expense risk. And there's nothing they can do about it. When they enter age 65, that's you. So the experiment is you take the American people, put into Sweden, and give all the risks and distribution of types that in Sweden, and see how these guys behave differently.
That's what I don't understand. I don't know what you mean calling risk or variance. It's hard to tell. So I would thought that the first candidate is one of the theory of Sweden is a different policy, where so many people say the big risk is the retirement home risk.
Mm-hmm.
And the low level, the Medicaid retirement home
Yeah,
has rats, and it's terrible.
yeah, that's what I heard. Yeah,
And that's what people try to avoid.
yes,
That account for the big disparity
yes,
and the big risk.
yes.
I don't think of that as risk. The thing is that it's a policy induced where the Medicaid Swedish version of the policy is either income tested, as it said, or wealth tested.
Yeah, I guess so. So I guess.
Or is it nicer that the worst possible outcome?
Mm.
Like putting it in risk, I don't know how to think of that. Is that people get sicker in the US in a more expensive way? How do I think of that?
No, I guess the way I present it is kind of agnostic about it. But I think one way to understand what you're doing is people facing the same kind of health risks, but in Sweden they're insured better. So that's a difference in policy, which appear as a difference in terms of the risk that I showed. No?
Let's just say, this isn't with allocation is the same, but I mean the way of paying for it is not. Is that the way to think of it?
Yeah, government pays more in Sweden, especially for the worst outcome in Sweden.
Yeah, but it's clearer if you model that as a policy directly.
Yeah, that's true. We could. Yeah, we could. I mean, we could map this into difference in policy by looking at the total medical expenses and out-of-pocket expenses, and the difference how the government takes part of the bill is basically a difference in policy.
That way
Yeah.
you can look at the policy.
Yeah, and then we can kind of distinguish the difference in risk and difference in policy. That's true. Yeah, yeah. So for now, yeah, please think that I mix these two into one. Yeah. Okay. So actually, so I guess the motivation why we started this project is we want to use these cross-country differences to understand the importance of this difference in risks in determining the slow decumulation pattern of retired households. But then what we really need to do is to estimate the model, assuming that the preferences are the same between the US and Sweden, and try to match US profiles, US data and the Swedish data at the same time with the same parameters for preferences. Okay, that's what we really want to do. But we haven't reached the stage yet, so that's how kind of we give additional kind of way to identify the importance of risk. Because as long as we assume that everything else is the same, the only difference between US and Sweden is a difference in terms of the risks that households face in terms of healthcare expenses. And that basically by assuming everything else is the same, we are forcing that the difference in risk is explaining the differences that I showed at the beginning, like a difference in the accumulation pattern. That's actually what ideally we want to do. But so far we managed to do is to estimate the model just using the US data, because we have difficulty matching both Swedish data and US data at the same time by assuming everything else is the same. So what we did is so far is not using the difference between US and Sweden as extra way to identify the parameters, but we now just use the US data for estimating the model parameters. Of course, we use all the inputs and the distribution of types from the US data, and that's part of the estimation exercise. And we assume that those parameters are, the preferences are same for the Swedish households, and we ask what happens if those households are in a Swedish environment, in particular with the risks we estimated from Swedish data. And actually, I'm going to show that in terms of the accumulation pattern of financial assets, the model does pretty well, but the model doesn't do well in terms of capturing the difference in the accumulation pattern of the total or net worth. That's why I guess we are struggling to kind of match both of them at the same time. That's why we are doing what I'm going to show right now.
Are you trying to have housing as well in here, or
Hmm?
not? You're abstracting from housing, or you have housing as well?
Oh, we have housing too, yeah.
Well,
yeah.
that makes it double hard, probably.
Yeah. So yeah. I guess that one thing we are trying to do is to go back to the one asset model and try to do the same exercise with one asset. Yeah, but in the previous work, we argued that by looking at the housing and financial asset, it gives us extra kind of way to identify the relative importance of different motives. So we try to kind of stick to this model. But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's probably the first step, I guess. So let me give you the overview of the model. So there's a choice of the consumption and the financial assets and housing. The housing services gives you utility, and housing is also part of the wealth. And we assume extra utility from owning a house. So basically you enjoy living in the same house that you've been living. And if you move out, that you lose this extra kind of private value. That parameter is very important in capturing this fact that very few households move out of their house, even if they can use this for consumption purpose after you sell and move to a small apartment. And we also have bequest motives, warm glow bequest motive, characterized by the strengths and the curvature of the utility of the bequest. And we abstract from the labor market, so we only look at the retirees, so the pension income is constant and that doesn't change throughout the life cycle. And the types of the risk that households are facing, a health risk about health, which is estimated from how the self-reported health status changes over time, and a mortality risk, which is part of the health risk, I guess, and household size, which is not very important, so don't worry too much about it, and healthcare expenses, which I think I showed already what they look like. And in terms of policy, we assume that Medicaid is captured by consumption floor guaranteed by the government, so if the household cannot consume this minimum amount because of the medical expense shock, then the government is going to step in and give you the gap. And in terms of the mortgage market, so far what we did is we assume that the household can borrow up to a certain fraction of the value of the house, and this fraction depends on age. So this is not we have some ways to kind of justify this, but so far we just try to use the data to back up this lambda parameter, which is quickly kind of going towards zero as households ages, to capture the fact that these households keep repaying and try not to borrow, even if they might benefit by borrowing and using the money to go to Hawaii or something. So the two types of households, homeowners and renters. And homeowners, the decision is either to remain a homeowner or become a renter. And this decision is irreversible. So if you once become a renter, you stay renter. And households can either save or borrow against the value of the house. Okay? And both of them is captured by this state A. For renters choose the size of the house to rent, which is not very important at the end. And renters can save, but not borrow, because they don't have a house to borrow against.
So the homeowner, they cannot downsize or anything. They either become renters
Yeah.
or they stick in their home.
Yeah.
But the renters can change the apartments by the rental unit
Yeah.
every period, I guess,
Yeah.
without transaction costs.
Yeah, yeah.
So is there an adjustment cost when you switch from owning a home to renting or things like that? I'm
Yes.
just thinking that's a cheap way of getting fast accumulation of financial assets and slow accumulation of housing assets. 'Cause
Oh, yeah,
if you
yeah.
get hit by a bad health shock,
Yeah.
you'll go tap into the asset stock that's cheaper to tap in. And
Mhm.
that
Yeah,
will
yeah.
not be the house.
No, it's cheap, but that's exactly what's happening. Yeah, there's a cost of selling a house. That's one-time cost of selling a house, but it's more like a cost. More than cost, what makes the homeowner stick to their house is this extra utility from living in the same house that you're familiar with. That's what keeps them. So, for example, if one of the we shut down this selling cost of the selling a house, but it doesn't change much. It's not. I mean, it's calibrated to be 6% of the value of the house, which is like from the data, and that's not enough to deter homeowners to sell the house.
Oh, really?
Yeah, in the model at least.
That's
Yeah. So here's the Bellman equation for renters, which is the simplest case. The household is characterized by the age, I, B is a level of income, S is the household size, which is not very important, M is the health status, X is the current medical expenses, whose distribution depends on age and income and household size and the current health status. And the renters don't have a house, so H equals to 0, and A is the current asset holdings. And the renter is going to maximize the sum of the current utility plus the continuation value. And if this renter dies at the end of this period, there is a utility from bequest, basically utility from the asset that this guy leaves to the world. And this is a budget constraint: consumption plus savings plus the rent payment plus the out-of-pocket medical expenses is equal to the current savings plus interest associated with the savings plus the pension income. Okay? And this next equation shows that the government is guaranteeing some level of consumption floor. And the preferences, we use constant relative risk aversion and for the aggregated consumption goods, and between housing and non-housing consumption, we use Cobb diagrams between the two. And this omega basically captures the extra private utility if you keep living in the same house that you're familiar with, the private value that you get from the house you keep living in.
Can I just ask something about the modeling here? Why
Sure.
didn't you, I mean, I like the specification with this extra utility from ownership, but why didn't you do something else like a rental premium or some other theory on why people hold on to housing? What made you choose this specification?
So I think, so we tried a rental premium, for example, but like the answer to her, rental premium, we observe the number for the rental premium, right? And it's really not enough to generate this high home ownership rate.
It's extremely high home
Yeah.
ownership.
So I don't think that's the explanation for the reason that many households
So
don't
this is
sell
kind
the
of a
house.
shortcut way of all the extra,
Yeah, it's kind of all the benefits from housing, tax benefit or the rental premium, everything's kind of pushed towards this omega parameter, I think. Yeah. And the utility from bequest is kind of standard with the level parameter and the curvature parameter. And the homeowners decide whether to move out or stay an owner. And if the homeowner is staying, then the homeowner pays a small maintenance cost and live in the same house. Okay? That's basically the only difference. And there is a age-dependent collateral constraint. So the homeowners can borrow up to 1 minus lambda, and lambda depends on the age of the value of the house. Okay? And once the homeowner decides to move out, the homeowner receives the value of the house by selling the house. And there's a kappa is the cost of the selling the house. And this homeowner becomes a renter in the next period. Okay? And let me start showing you some model inputs to the model. These are the summary statistics from the distribution at age 65, which we take as given. So at age 65, we see the data, the type distribution, and we take it as given. There's nothing that households can change. And in terms of health status in the US, about 45% say they're in excellent health. And in Sweden, Swedish people are less optimistic than the Americans, 38%. And we talked already, almost 90% are homeowners at age 65, and about 80% are homeowners in Sweden. And 21% of the American households are borrowing, have a net negative asset position at age 65, and the corresponding number for Sweden is 27%. So they are kind of similar, but there's slight differences. And their income beans, the income is more spread out across different income beans in the US. And these are health transition probability, 2-year health transition probability that we got from the data in HRS and for the US on top, and from the share for the case of Sweden. So these health transition probabilities are age dependent. So we are showing just for age 65, 75, 85, and 95, and same for Sweden. And you can see that the probability of remaining in an excellent state just keeps declining, which is normal. And yeah, so basically the health in general keeps deteriorating over the life cycle, which is same for Sweden. So these are, we computed from the actual transition probabilities in the health changes the distribution of the out-of-pocket medical expenses. Yeah. That's the only thing that the health does. And of course, also the probability of survival, because death is an absorbing health state. And these are some parameters that we take from the data, like a maintenance cost 1.7% per year, house selling cost 6.6% of the house value, and the interest rate is 4%, and mortgage interest premium is 1.6%. So these are the estimated parameters, but let me show how the model is estimated. So we use the different kinds of life cycle profiles for the US that I showed. So in particular, median net worth and home ownership rate, median housing assets among homeowners, and the median financial assets. And the solid line is the data. Solid line is the model, and the dotted line is from the data that I showed already a couple of times.
It's a different color.
Yeah, but wait, you see why. You see why. Yeah. Because I keep showing US in blue, so I stick with blue. Yeah. It's not like I was lazy or didn't think through. So the model actually, in terms of the housing asset, it's a little bit off, but in general, the model does better in capturing this pattern. In terms of both median financial assets, total asset, and home ownership rate, all don't decline very fast from age 65 to 90. And here's why. So here's the comparison. So this is a kind of counterfactual experiment. So we use the same estimated parameters from the US data, and we assume that they are the same for the Swedish households, but we put the risk for facing the Swedish households, and we also use the type distribution of this. Yeah.
So the theory of Sweden is that initial home ownership, initial wealth distribution, and initial health.
They're different.
And the transition for the health.
Yes.
And then also some estimated imputation of a shock to expenditures that happens.
Yes.
But how did you get that? Like, what's the orders of magnitude difference there of those things? Like 5 times larger?
You mean the size of the risks?
Yeah, so what you have in mind is something like what?
I think I showed you here. So this is a standard deviation for different, let's say, income groups or the health state, self-reported health status. This is Sweden, about 1 log unit, and in the US it's about 1.5.
So that's what you mean by the largest
Yeah, 50%,
shocks
yeah.
that happened from
Yes. Yes, that's what I mean. So this is basically model inputs to the model. So we use this when we estimate the model, and in a Swedish counterfactual, we use those as inputs. And of course, we use this type distribution from Sweden as one of the inputs. And as transition probabilities of health as well. So here's the model predicts about Sweden with the same preference parameters estimated from the US data. So what I want to emphasize is that in terms of the median financial assets, I said at the beginning that so first of all, we use the exact type distribution, so it starts exactly the same from data because by definition it matches at age 65. And Sweden model predicts a much faster decumulation pattern than the American households just by the difference in the risks that they are facing. And that kind of basically in general consistent with what we see in terms of the US-Swedish differences in terms of median financial asset decumulation pattern. And in terms of total assets, we don't quite get the faster decumulation in Sweden. So this is a model output in terms of Swedish experiment, and this is the data. So the model kind of generates like half of what we see in terms of difference between US and Sweden in terms of total asset decumulation pattern. And one of the reasons is home ownership rate doesn't decline as much in the Swedish model. In the data, it keeps declining gradually, but in the model, somehow it converges to the same level as the US. So that's one, and the housing is a big chunk of the wealth, so that's one reason why we don't get all the way down here. So that's why if we try to estimate these two simultaneously, we don't have enough degree of freedom in terms of the model to get pink and blue at the same time, so that's what we are kind of sort of struggling now.
Are the fixed costs of selling a house
Yeah.
same between
Yeah.
US and, is it about 6% there as well?
Yeah.
Oh.
Actually, that might be different. Yeah, we're trying to figure out those things right now. Yeah.
Is the problem that you're overestimating risk? Could that be the reason?
What do you mean by overestimating?
Because you're taking a dispersion.
Yeah.
Every dispersion moment that you get in any data has some heterogeneity.
True. Yeah. So we ignore any unknown.
You call it risk. So your agent, you see them in the data. They don't act on them.
Yeah.
They act on something much more narrow.
Possibly, yes.
Which is probably why for the US we never find this curve that is much below the
I mean, if
I don't know to what extent, and I'm sure you overestimate risk.
mm-hmm.
The way you do it.
Yeah, because I don't allow any
So
unobserved
there's
heterogeneity.
estimated jointly
Yeah.
as a heterogeneity term, right? Which
Yeah.
would be confronted to the variance in whatever shock you're estimating.
Yeah, that's
Because it's saying it's modeling as risk, I need to spend some money on Botox. That's the risk that you have.
yes, but that's not the answer to his question. I think his answer is unobserved heterogeneity is not.
Yeah, it must be individuals who actually foresee
Yeah.
this. And what you call a risk is actually just.
Yeah, so I don't.
When you fit it to data, and the people react to what they see, not what they
Yes.
assume that they see.
Yes. So yeah, we thought about it, but I don't know what to do about it. So.
You have to estimate a more complicated model.
Yeah.
There's no way out.
Yeah. I mean, yes. That's fair. Yeah. So. So there are a lot of differences between US and Sweden in the model, and what's contributing in generating those differences between the US and Swedish counterfactual. And a big part is, of course, as you expect, it's the shocks, in particular the medical expense risk, which is much smaller in Sweden. So if I keep the type distribution for the US one, but I put the Swedish shock to the US households, then you get a very fast accumulation pattern, which confirms that the risk is the important element in generating the differences between the US and Swedish accumulation pattern. But also it's interesting that if you, in terms of the home, no, it's okay, this one. But if you just change the initial type distribution to the Swedish one, but keep the American risk, then they accumulate much slower, like you expect, because the risk is smaller. But they start just slower. So. And you can generally see the similar pattern for the median net worth, but but the risk seems to be explained much less in terms of the difference between the Swedish and American total asset accumulation.
Isn't it a natural thing to think of a different consumption floor? And then
Yeah.
what it looks like risk is just an accounting artifact of how they put that consumption floor.
What do you mean? So consumption floor must be different between Sweden and US?
No, because they give you a retirement home without rats.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, you don't need, you don't want, Americans want to keep assets to buy retirement home without rats and not hit the consumption floor,
Uh-huh.
while Swedes fear that less.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that would be the natural thing, and then the difference what you call risk is just an accounting way of what the same risk, how the same risks are financed. One of them is when a Swedish guy gets hit by this thing, the government ends up having to input a much larger chunk because it has a higher consumption floor. And the American government feels very little because many people pay for themselves. They're so scared of such low consumption floor that they don't want to go there. And you could see some of that by comparing how many people are in retirement homes. Government finance retirement homes relative to private.
Yeah, that's true. That's probably we should do that. Yeah. But I'm not sure we have that data for Sweden, but for the US for sure, yeah, we can do that. Yeah. Yeah. And like I have less than 5 minutes, I guess.
1 minute.
Okay. So last thing I want to show is that it's actually the health. So I further decompose the difference between the US and Sweden. So if I change only the medical expense shock, but everything else is the same for everything else remains the same for the US, we get most of what we got for the Swedish counterfactual, which is this green line. Okay. So for example, one funny thing that if we make if you just change the health transition to the Swedish one, because Swedish guys are more pessimistic about the transition, they save more, they keep the saving higher. So it's working to the opposite direction actually. So what's really working is what I call the medical out-of-pocket medical expense risk is much smaller in Sweden. That pushes down this accumulation of financial assets. But in terms of the housing, most of the stuff is generated by the initial differences, and they just except for the last 5 years, they just move in the parallel. So most of the differences between US and Sweden that I showing the data are generated by initial differences, and the slope is basically predicted to be the same, and that's more or less consistent with what we see in the data. So at the end, what we found is that most of the differences in financial asset accumulation pattern between US and Sweden is captured by the model, but just by difference in the risk that these households are facing. But only half of the net worth accumulation is captured by difference in the risk. And for the housing, it's mostly accounted for difference. Risk doesn't really matter for the housing, which is consistent with what we found before or what others argue. So they're not used to pay for the medical expenses, the value of the house. Okay. So this is the last slide. So what we did in this project is we tried to give another estimate for the importance of healthcare risks in explaining the saving pattern of elderly households, especially financial assets, because housing seems to be kind of out of this picture. And it's consistent with the cross-country evidence, in particular US versus Sweden and some other Northern European countries, because they seem to accumulate financial assets especially faster than the US, and not the housing. Housing seems to be kind of on a similar accumulation pattern, slow accumulation pattern, which are not affected by the difference in the risks. And at the end, what we really want to do is to try to kind of add more reasonable differences between US and Sweden so we can capture the US profiles and Swedish profile at the same time and estimate the whole thing together. And some candidates probably it's the cost of selling a housing or cost of how tight the mortgage is, a difference in the policy, social safety net, inheritance tax, or the kind of taxes, or maybe the difference in the bequest pattern, social norm. The bequest strengths might be different. So we're trying to think about what we allow to change and what kind of numbers we try to reasonably put in terms of capturing some other observable differences between the US and Sweden to estimate the model again with using all the data combined. That's what we are trying to do. So, okay, that's all.
Okay, thank you. Some more questions?